Imagine a world suddenly waking up after a long nap. That's essentially what the Renaissance was. The word itself is French for rebirth. After the Middle Ages, or what some historians called the Dark Ages, people in Europe rediscovered the amazing wisdom, art, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This period, stretching from the 1300s to about the 1600s, wasn't just about looking backward. It was about taking those old ideas and using them to launch Europe into the modern age. It was a time when the focus shifted from solely preparing for the afterlife to celebrating what people could achieve right here on Earth. So, why did this rebirth start in Italy? Two main reasons: location and money. Italy was home to the ancient Roman Empire, meaning the physical ruins, the buildings, statues, and manuscripts were literally everywhere, ready to be rediscovered. More importantly, cities like Florence and Venice were centers of bustling trade, making their merchant class incredibly wealthy. These wealthy families, like the famous Medici family, became patrons of the arts. Think of a patron as a rich sponsor who pays artists and thinkers to create great work. If you had money, you could hire a Michelangelo. At the core of the Renaissance was an intellectual movement called Humanism. For hundreds of years, the focus had been almost entirely on the church, God, and religious salvation. Humanism turned that focus around to celebrate the human being. Humanists studied the classics, history, poetry, and philosophy to understand human nature, potential, and achievements. It wasn't about ignoring God, but rather about saying, hey, humans are amazing too. We should celebrate our talents. Humanism introduced three massive shifts in thinking. First was individualism, the belief that one person's talents and potential matter. It's why we started seeing portraits of individuals, not just biblical figures. Second was secularism, which simply means a growing interest in the world and daily life, not just religious matters. And finally, classicism was the return to the ideas of the Greeks and Romans. The humanists saw the ancients as the pinnacle of human achievement and wanted to recreate that high culture. Every movement needs a starting point, and for humanism, that was the Italian poet Petrarch. He's often called the father of humanism. Petrarch dedicated his life to searching through moldy monastery libraries for forgotten Latin manuscripts. He literally dusted off the works of Cicero and other Roman writers. He believed these texts, full of practical wisdom and moral philosophy, could help people live better lives in the present, not just worry about the future. His work inspired a whole generation of scholars to look to the classics for answers. The humanist movement completely changed how people thought about learning. Before, education was mostly focused on theology and preparing for religious life. The humanists had a different idea. The purpose of education was to create a virtuous and well-rounded citizen, someone who could speak eloquently, participate in government, and appreciate the arts. They championed the idea of the Renaissance man, a person skilled in multiple fields like art, science, and poetry. Leonardo da Vinci would become the perfect example of this ideal. In the Middle Ages, art was mostly flat, symbolic, and focused on religious scenes. Renaissance art exploded with life and detail. Artists wanted to capture the beauty of the human form and the natural world with incredible realism. To do this, they didn't just guess. They became scientists. They studied human anatomy by observing and even dissecting bodies to truly understand muscles and bone structure. This scientific approach is why Renaissance paintings and sculptures look so incredibly lifelike. Perhaps the single greatest invention in Renaissance painting was linear perspective. Before, paintings looked two-dimensional and flat. Architect Filippo Brunelleschi and later artist Masaccio figured out a mathematical way to trick the eye. They used a vanishing point where all the parallel lines in a painting appear to meet, creating the perfect illusion of depth and distance on a flat canvas. This one innovation made their art jump off the wall and revolutionized painting forever. When you think of the ultimate Renaissance figure, you think of Leonardo da Vinci. He truly embodied the Renaissance man ideal. His curiosity was boundless. He didn't just paint masterpieces like the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper. He was also a botanist, a geologist, a musician, and an engineer. He saw the world as a giant puzzle to be solved, and used his art to express his scientific understanding of how things worked. Da Vinci's curiosity is best seen in his famous notebooks. He filled thousands of pages, writing in mirror image and drawing intricate diagrams of everything he observed. Inside, you can find sketches of perfectly proportioned human bodies, designs for early flying machines and helicopters, and detailed engineering plans. These notebooks are a perfect example of the Renaissance idea that art and science weren't separate. They were two sides of the same quest for knowledge. Another genius of the High Renaissance was Michelangelo. While Leonardo was the ultimate painter-scientist, Michelangelo was the ultimate sculptor-artist. He saw sculpture as the highest art form, believing that the figure was already trapped inside the marble block, and his job was just to set it free. Look at his incredible David, or the powerful figures on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. He gave his figures intense emotion and physical power, truly celebrating the divine beauty of the human body. Rounding out the trio of high Renaissance masters is Raphael. Known for his graceful, harmonious paintings, Raphael was particularly brilliant at capturing human relationships and balance. His most famous fresco, The School of Athens, is painted in the Vatican. It's not a religious scene, but a grand tribute to classical philosophy, featuring Plato, Aristotle, and other great thinkers. It's a perfect visual summary of the Renaissance, honoring the classical past right in the heart of the church's headquarters. The Renaissance didn't just change painting, it changed how buildings looked too. Renaissance architects ditched the tall, spiky, dark style of Gothic architecture. They looked back to the principles of ancient Greek and Roman temples, emphasizing symmetry, balance, and clean, simple proportions. They brought back the use of columns, arches, and most famously, the magnificent dome, like the one designed by Brunelleschi for the Florence Cathedral, which became a symbol of the entire age. The humanist push for observation and inquiry eventually spilled over from art into science, helping to kick off the scientific revolution. Thinkers stopped relying on ancient books or religious doctrine as the only sources of truth. Instead, they demanded proof using observation, mathematics, and experimentation. This new approach was revolutionary and fundamentally changed how people understood the natural world, forever altering the relationship between science and faith. For over 1,000 years, everyone, including the Church, believed in the geocentric theory, that the Earth was the center of the universe. Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus dared to challenge this. He proposed the heliocentric theory, which correctly placed the Sun at the center of our solar system. This was a massive shift in human thought, essentially demoting Earth from the center of creation. Although published toward the end of his life, his work provided the mathematical foundation for modern astronomy. A few decades after Copernicus, Italian scientist Galileo Galilei took the next big step. Using an improved telescope, which he actually didn't invent but perfected, he observed mountains on the moon, sunspots, and most importantly, 4 moons orbiting Jupiter. These observations provided the physical evidence needed to confirm Copernicus's sun-centered model. Unfortunately, This put him directly in conflict with the Catholic Church, leading to a famous trial and a powerful clash between new science and old authority. Perhaps the single most important event for the spread of Renaissance ideas was the invention of the Gutenberg printing press around 1440. Before this, books had to be copied by hand, a slow and expensive process that kept knowledge locked up in monasteries. The printing press made books cheap and fast to produce, which dramatically increased literacy across Europe. Suddenly, people could read the Bible, classical texts, and new scientific ideas for themselves, giving power to the individual and speeding up the Renaissance 100-fold. As the wealth and trade networks expanded, so did the Renaissance. The ideas didn't stay locked in Italy. They traveled north to countries like France, Germany, and England. This northern Renaissance had a slightly different flavor. While still focused on humanism and classicism, it placed a greater emphasis on Christian humanism. These thinkers wanted to use the principles of classical education to reform the church and society, making people more moral and religious in their daily lives. The Northern Renaissance produced its own crop of geniuses. Erasmus was the greatest Christian humanist. He stressed inner piety and reading the Bible over external rituals. In England, you have the greatest playwright in history, William Shakespeare, whose plays focus deeply on the complexities, flaws, and emotions of the individual human character. In the Netherlands, Flemish painters like Jan van Eyck pioneered the use of oil paints to achieve stunning realism and detail in their work. So what's the big takeaway from the Renaissance? It wasn't just a brief moment of beautiful art. It was the birth of the modern mindset. It successfully shifted thought away from a medieval focus on dogma to a modern focus on rationality, observation, and the individual. It gave us the ideals of the well-rounded person. It sparked the scientific revolution, and it set the stage for all the political and religious changes that followed, creating the world you live in today.